In the sweltering heat of Little Rock, Arkansas, in the late 1880s, a baby girl was born into a world that would never be ready for her. Florence Beatrice Smith entered life on April 9, 1887, in a city where the color of her skin would determine almost every opportunity she would ever receive. Her mother, a schoolteacher with a deep love for music, recognized something extraordinary in her daughter from the very beginning. By the time Florence was 4 years old, she was already performing piano recitals, her small fingers dancing across the keys with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone so young. Florence's childhood home was filled with the sound of music. Her mother gave her rigorous training, pushing her to master not just piano but music theory, composition, and organ as well. While other children played outside, Florence spent hours at the keyboard, absorbing everything her mother could teach her. She published her first composition at the age of 11, a remarkable achievement for any child, let alone a young black girl in the American South. Her talent was undeniable, brilliant even, yet the world around her seemed determined to look the other way. When Florence graduated high school at 14, she was the valedictorian of her class. Her excellence could not be ignored, but it also could not open the doors that remained firmly closed to someone who looked like her. She dreamed of studying music at the highest level, of learning from the great masters and refining her craft among serious musicians. Her family scraped together what they could, and Florence set her sights on the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, one of the finest music schools in the country. But there was a catch. The conservatory accepted her application only because she listed herself as Mexican. In order to pursue her passion, Florence had to hide who she truly was. The years at the conservatory were both exhilarating and exhausting. Florence excelled in her studies, earning teaching certificates in piano and organ. She studied composition and counterpoint, absorbing the European classical tradition that dominated the music world. But she lived with a constant tension, knowing that her acceptance came with a lie, that her true identity had to remain concealed. When she graduated in 1906 with honors, she returned to the South carrying both her dreams and the heavy knowledge of just how limited her options would be. Back in the South, Florence taught music at Shorter College in Arkansas and later at Clark University in Atlanta. She married Thomas J. Price, a lawyer, and together they started a family. She had 2 daughters and tried to build a life that balanced her roles as wife, mother, and musician. She continued to compose, pouring her heart into pieces that blended the classical training she had received with the spirituals and folk songs she had grown up hearing. Her music was unique, rich with the rhythms and melodies of her heritage, yet structured with the sophistication of European forms. But composition was seen as a man's domain, and a black woman composing symphonies was almost unthinkable in the eyes of the musical establishment. The 1920s brought violence and fear to many black communities across America. The resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan made life increasingly dangerous in Little Rock. Florence and Thomas made the difficult decision to leave everything behind and move north to Chicago as part of the Great Migration. Thousands of black families were making the same choice, seeking safety and opportunity in northern cities. Florence hoped that Chicago, with its vibrant cultural scene and growing black community, might offer her the chance to finally be recognized as a serious composer. Chicago was indeed different from Little Rock, but it was not the promised land Florence had imagined. She still faced rejection after rejection. Concert halls were not interested in programming works by a black woman. Publishers turned down her compositions. She gave piano lessons to support her family, playing for church services and community events, all while continuing to compose in whatever spare moments she could find. Her marriage to Thomas became strained and eventually ended in divorce, leaving her to raise her daughters alone. Money was always tight. Recognition seemed impossibly far away, yet Florence refused to stop composing. Late at night, after her daughters were asleep and her teaching duties were done, she wrote. She poured her experiences into her music, the pain of discrimination, the beauty of her cultural heritage, the longing for acceptance, and the fierce determination that had carried her this far. She composed symphonies, concertos, chamber works, and songs. Her manuscripts piled up in her small apartment, unperformed and unheard by the wider world. Friends and fellow musicians who knew her work marveled at its quality, but that admiration did not translate into performances or publication. By 1932, Florence Price was in her mid-40s. She had been composing seriously for decades with almost nothing to show for it in terms of public recognition. She had the training, the talent, and an impressive body of work, but she remained invisible to the musical establishment that could make or break a composer's career. She might have given up, might have accepted that her music would never be heard beyond her small circle. But then she learned about a competition, the Wanamaker Foundation Prize, which was open to all composers regardless of race or gender. It was a moment of possibility, a door that might actually open. Florence decided to take one more chance. She selected her symphony in E minor, a work that represented everything she wanted to say through music, and submitted it to the competition. What happened next would change not just her life, but the course of American classical music history. The envelope arrived on an ordinary day, but its contents were anything but ordinary. Florence Price had won first place in the Wanamaker Foundation Prize competition for her symphony in E minor. She had also won third place for her piano sonata. The prize money of $500 was substantial, enough to ease some of her financial worries, but the real prize was something far more valuable. The recognition meant that serious musicians and critics would have to pay attention to her work. Her name would appear in newspapers. Her music would be performed. After decades of being overlooked, Florence Price was finally being seen. The win created a ripple of excitement in Chicago's Black community and among progressive musicians who had long advocated for more diverse voices in classical music. Florence received congratulations from friends and colleagues who had always believed in her talent. But winning a competition was one thing. Getting a major symphony orchestra to actually perform her work was something else entirely. The classical music world in 1932 was still overwhelmingly white and male. Orchestras rarely programmed works by women composers, and works by Black composers were virtually non-existent in their repertoires. Florence knew that her victory might mean nothing if no one was willing to take the next step. Then came news that seemed almost impossible to believe. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra, one of the most prestigious orchestras in America, was going to perform her symphony in E minor. The conductor Frederick Stock had decided to program her work for a concert on June 15, 1933, at the World's Fair being held in Chicago. Stock was taking a considerable risk. He faced criticism from those who thought a symphony by a Black woman had no place on a major concert program. But Stock believed in the quality of the music, and he was willing to stand by his decision. As the performance date approached, Florence experienced a mixture of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. This was everything she had worked toward for her entire life, yet the weight of expectation was crushing. She was not just representing herself. She was representing every Black composer who had been denied opportunities, every woman who had been told that serious composition was not for her. The pressure was immense. What if the performance went badly? What if critics hated her work? What if this one chance proved to everyone that composers like her did not belong in the concert hall? Florence attended rehearsals, listening as the Chicago Symphony Orchestra brought her music to life. Hearing the themes she had written in her small apartment now played by a full orchestra was almost surreal. The musicians were professional and skilled, treating her score with the same seriousness they gave to Beethoven and Brahms. Stock worked with the orchestra to capture the nuances of her composition, the way she had woven spirituals and traditional black musical elements into the classical symphonic form. Her symphony in E minor was distinctly American, drawing on the musical heritage that was so often dismissed as unsophisticated and elevating it to the concert hall. The night of June 15, 1933, arrived. Florence sat in the audience at the Chicago Civic Opera House, surrounded by thousands of people who had come to hear the World's Fair concert. Her heart pounded as the orchestra took their places on stage. Frederick Stock raised his baton, and then her symphony began. The opening movement flowed through the hall, the strings carrying the main theme while woodwinds added color and depth. Florence listened to every note, every phrase, hearing both what she had intended and what the orchestra was creating in that moment. The music moved through its four movements, from the dramatic opening through the lyrical second movement, the energetic third movement, and finally the powerful conclusion. When the final notes faded and silence held the hall for just a moment, the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Florence felt tears on her face as the applause continued. Frederick Stock gestured toward where she sat, and the audience's cheers grew even louder. She had done it. Her symphony had been performed by a major American orchestra, and the audience had loved it. In that moment, years of rejection and invisibility seemed to fall away. She had proven that her music belonged here, that she belonged here. The newspapers the next day published reviews of the concert, and critics praised her symphony. They wrote about the skillful orchestration, the memorable themes, and the successful blending of different musical traditions. Some reviews mentioned her race and gender, treating her achievement as a curiosity or a novelty, but the music itself received genuine acclaim. The performance was historic, the first time a major American orchestra had performed a symphony composed by a black woman. Florence Price had broken through a barrier that many had thought unbreakable. In the weeks and months that followed, Florence waited to see what would come next. Would orchestras around the country want to perform her work? Would publishers rush to print her compositions? Would she finally be able to support herself through her music rather than through teaching? She had achieved something remarkable, something that should have opened every door. But she quickly learned that one triumph, even a historic one, did not guarantee lasting change. The musical establishment had acknowledged her once, but that did not mean they were ready to fully embrace her or composers like her. Still, the performance had changed something fundamental. Florence Price was no longer just a talented musician known only to a small circle. She was a composer whose work had been performed and celebrated on one of the biggest stages in American music. She had students who wanted to learn from her. She had fellow composers who respected her craft. And most importantly, she had proven to herself that her music mattered, that all those years of composing in obscurity had not been in vain. The road ahead would still be difficult, still filled with obstacles, but Florence Price had taken a step that could never be undone. Her music had been heard, and the world would never be quite the same. The success of the 1933 performance should have been a turning point that transformed Florence Price's career completely. She had proven her abilities on the grandest stage possible, yet the flood of opportunities she had hoped for never materialized. A few more performances of her works followed, scattered and infrequent, but major orchestras were not rushing to program her compositions. Publishers remained hesitant to take on her music. The recognition she had gained seemed to have limits that became painfully clear as time went on. The classical music world was willing to celebrate her as a historic first, but it was not yet ready to treat her as simply one of many great composers whose works deserved regular performance. Florence refused to let disappointment stop her from creating. If orchestras would not come to her, she would continue to write music that demanded to be heard. Through the 1930s and 1940s, she composed at an astonishing pace. She wrote 4 symphonies, numerous concertos for piano and violin, chamber works, art songs, and arrangements of spirituals. Her catalog grew to include more than 300 compositions. She wrote music for the instruments she knew best, creating works that showcased the piano and organ. But she also expanded her range, composing pieces for full orchestra and various instrumental combinations. Every piece reflected her unique voice, that remarkable blend of European classical forms and African American musical traditions that made her work unlike anything else being written at the time. She found allies and supporters who believed in her music and worked to promote it. The renowned black contralto Marian Anderson performed Florence's arrangements of spirituals, bringing them to audiences across America and Europe. Anderson's beautiful voice gave life to Florence's sensitive settings of these traditional songs, and their collaboration helped both women reach wider audiences. Florence also worked with other black musicians who were fighting their own battles for recognition in classical music. They supported each other, performed each other's works, and created opportunities where the mainstream musical establishment would not. Florence wrote letters, dozens and dozens of letters, to conductors, orchestra managers, and musical organizations. She sent scores, requested performances, and made her case with grace and persistence. She wrote to Serge Koussevitzky, the celebrated conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, asking him to consider programming her work. She contacted Eugene Ormandy of the Philadelphia Orchestra. She reached out to Leopold Stokowski, one of the most famous conductors in America. Some responded with polite rejections, others never replied at all. The letters she received back, when they came, often included praise for her talent followed by excuses about why her music could not be performed. Programming was already set, budgets were tight, audiences were not ready for such music. The reasons varied, but the result was always the same. What hurt most was knowing that her music was good enough. The few conductors and musicians who had performed her works praised their quality. Critics who heard her compositions recognized their merit. But quality alone was not enough to overcome the double barrier of her race and gender. White male composers with far less talent and far fewer achievements had their works performed regularly by major orchestras. Florence could not help but see the injustice of it, the way the system was rigged against her from the start. Yet she channeled her frustration into her music rather than letting it destroy her spirit. She did achieve some victories. In 1940, the renowned violinist Ruth Hanks performed Florence's Violin Concerto in Mississippi, bringing serious classical music by a black composer to the Deep South. Other performers occasionally programmed her works, creating moments of recognition that reminded Florence why she continued to fight. She received commissions for new pieces, though they paid far less than commissions given to white male composers. She taught students who went on to have their own musical careers, passing on her knowledge and her determination to a new generation. Financial struggles remained a constant reality. Florence never achieved the financial security that should have come with her level of talent and achievement. She continued to give piano lessons, play for church services, and take whatever musical work she could find to pay her bills. The money from performances and publications was never enough to live on. She watched as white composers of far lesser ability enjoyed comfortable careers while she scrambled to make ends meet. The unfairness of it was exhausting, but she persisted because the music itself demanded to be written. Through it all, Florence kept composing. She wrote a second symphony, then a third, then a fourth. Each one showed growth in her craft, new explorations of form and expression. She composed her piano concerto in one movement, a work of stunning beauty and virtuosity. She wrote her concerto in D minor for piano and orchestra, another major work that deserved to be part of the standard repertoire. She created art songs that set poetry to music with exquisite sensitivity. She arranged spirituals, honoring the musical traditions of her ancestors while bringing them into the concert hall with sophisticated harmonizations and orchestrations. Her music told stories that the classical music world rarely heard. She drew on the rhythms of jazz and blues, the melodies of spirituals, the harmonies of European Romanticism, creating something distinctly American and distinctly her own. She wrote with both intellect and emotion, crafting works that were technically sophisticated yet deeply moving. Every composition was an act of resistance, a refusal to accept that her voice did not belong in the world of serious music. By the late 1940s, Florence Price had created a body of work that rivaled that of any American composer of her generation. She had written masterworks that should have been performed regularly by orchestras across the country. She had proven time and again that she belonged among the great composers, yet she remained largely unknown outside of specific musical circles. The breakthrough of 1933 had not led to the lasting recognition she deserved. The struggle continued, and Florence faced it with the same determination that had carried her from Little Rock to Boston to Chicago, through every rejection and every closed door. She was a composer, and nothing would stop her from composing. Nothing would stop her from composing. Florence Price continued composing until the very end of her life, driven by a passion that no amount of rejection could extinguish. Through the early 1950s, she worked on new pieces while trying to secure performances for the many works that sat unplayed in her collection. She attended concerts when she could, always listening, always learning, always thinking about how she could improve her craft. Her daughters had grown and started their own lives, and Florence found herself living alone, surrounded by manuscripts that represented decades of creative work. She corresponded with musicians, maintained her teaching studio, and kept writing letters to orchestras and conductors, still hoping that the world might finally be ready to embrace her music fully. On June 3, 1953, Florence Price died of a stroke in Chicago at the age of 66. Her passing was noted in some newspapers, particularly in black publications that recognized her historic achievements, but it did not make major headlines in the mainstream press. There was no grand memorial concert, no retrospective of her works by major orchestras, no outpouring of recognition from the classical music establishment. She was buried quietly, her legacy uncertain, her music largely unperformed. The compositions she had worked on so tirelessly, the symphonies and concertos and songs that had consumed her life, sat in boxes and filing cabinets, silent and forgotten by most of the musical world. In the decades that followed her death, Florence Price's name faded from public memory. Occasionally, a scholar researching black composers or women in music would mention her, noting her historic 1933 performance, but her actual music remained largely unheard. Libraries and archives held some of her scores, but they gathered dust on shelves. The few recordings that existed were rare and hard to find. Young musicians studying composition learned about Copland and Gershwin, Bernstein and Barber, but Price's name was absent from their textbooks. It seemed that history had made its judgment, and Florence Price would be remembered, if at all, as a footnote rather than as the major composer she truly was. But music, like truth, has a way of refusing to stay buried forever. In 2009, more than 50 years after Florence's death, a couple bought an abandoned summer home in Illinois. The house had been left to decay, its windows broken, its rooms filled with debris and the accumulated damage of decades of neglect. As the new owners began cleaning out the property, preparing to renovate it, they made a discovery that would change music history. Hidden in the house were boxes and boxes of manuscripts, piles of handwritten musical scores, letters, and personal papers. They had stumbled upon a treasure trove of Florence Price's music, works that no one knew existed, compositions that had never been performed or published. The discovery included her violin concertos, her Fourth Symphony, numerous songs, chamber works, and other pieces that expanded the known catalog of her compositions significantly. Scholars and musicians who learned about the find were stunned. Here was a major American composer whose work had been sitting in an abandoned house, forgotten and at risk of being lost forever. The manuscripts were carefully preserved and catalogued, and suddenly Florence Price's music began to receive the attention it had been denied during her lifetime. Orchestras started programming her works with increasing frequency. The Fort Smith Symphony performed her Third Symphony in 2009. In 2018, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the same orchestra that had premiered her First Symphony 85 years earlier, performed her music again under conductor Marin Alsop. Major orchestras around the world began including Price's compositions in their seasons. The Philadelphia Orchestra, the Atlanta Symphony, the Baltimore Symphony, orchestras that had ignored her letters during her lifetime, now competed to perform her works. Her piano concerto was recorded and released commercially. Her symphonies were performed and broadcast on classical radio stations. Musicians who performed her music spoke with genuine excitement about its quality. They talked about the beautiful melodies, the sophisticated orchestration, the way Price had created a uniquely American sound. Critics who reviewed these new performances praised the works, noting that this was music that should have been part of the standard repertoire all along. Recordings of her compositions began to proliferate, making her music accessible to listeners around the world. Young composers discovered her scores and found inspiration in how she had forged her own path and created her own voice. The rediscovery of Florence Price's music raised uncomfortable questions about how many other talented composers had been overlooked because of their race or gender. It highlighted the biases that had shaped classical music programming for generations. It made people wonder what other treasures might be sitting in attics and basements, what other voices had been silenced by discrimination and prejudice. Florence's story became not just about one woman's struggle, but about the systematic exclusion of entire groups of people from opportunities they deserved. Today, Florence Price is finally receiving the recognition she was denied during her lifetime. Concert programs list her name alongside the great American composers. Music students study her scores and learn about her contributions to classical music. Young musicians, particularly young Black musicians and young women, see in her story both the injustice of the past and the possibility of change. Her music is performed regularly, enjoyed by audiences who find in it beauty, sophistication, and emotional depth. The symphony that made history in 1933 is now part of the permanent repertoire, available on recordings and performed by orchestras around the world. Florence Price spent her life fighting to be heard, fighting for her music to be taken seriously, fighting against a system that tried to make her invisible. She composed masterwork after masterwork, never knowing if they would ever be performed, never knowing if future generations would remember her name. She died without seeing the full recognition she deserved. But her music survived, waiting patiently in the darkness until the world was finally ready to listen. And now, decades after her death, Florence Price has achieved what she always hoped for. Her music is being heard, celebrated, and cherished. She has taken her rightful place in the history of American music, and her voice, so long silenced, now rings out clearly for all to hear. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.